number 9. 1 Corinthians chapter number 9. So Brother Gaddis and I will be preaching the same text pretty much the duration of the remodel project. And so basically we are going about outlining the chapter and coming up with what we think is the message, and then sharing them with each other, and a comparison. And if I'm wrong, then I'm going to use his message and get right. If he's right, then he'll use his own message, because of course his is going to be right. So we're sharing notes back and forth, having a good time through 1 Corinthians. But we wanted you to be able to hear the same text that they're hearing over at the church. And so we're going to take off from 1 Corinthians chapter number 9. Last time you heard a message in 1 Corinthians, then you heard Brother Gaddis preach 1 Corinthians 8. So here we are, chapter number 9, starting in verse number 1. You follow along as I read these first 18 verses. Paul speaking, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. Mine answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat and to drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas? Have not we power to forbear working? Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith he altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we? Rather, nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be done so unto me, for it were better for me to die, than that any man should make my glorying void. For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. For if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me, what is my reward then? Verily, that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Thank you. You may be seated. I've entitled this message tonight out of this passage, Love Restricts My Liberty. Love restricts my liberty. Don't we live in a culture, in a world, and a society, particularly in this country, that seems very concerned about what rights you have? Sure. Everything from the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution of this country to rights that we perceive we have whenever we're told we can't do something. I have a right. That's my right. These are my rights. We hear that quite often. I started thinking about some of the different kinds of rights you hear about on the news. You have civil rights, equal rights, gay rights, women's rights, workers' rights, children's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ rights, right to privacy, of late, the right to die. I mean, we just seems that everyone thinks they have a right to do, to be, to have, to go wherever they want, whenever they want, regardless of who may be hurt. And if in any way you restrict someone's perceived right, you're in trouble. I had the right to do that, and now you're in trouble. And that's the American mentality. That's how we operate in this country. Everybody has a right. You don't want to infringe on anybody's rights, or else the ACLU shows up. Problem is that mentality, it invades the church.
Yeah, that's right.
It invades this American mentality, has invaded or does invade our mentality as believers, and we think we have rights too. And they're very important to us. We have liberty to do certain things, and we have the right because I have the liberty to do certain things, and it becomes very important to us, that liberty, my right, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we put those liberties ahead of everything. Now, in chapter number 8, you'll remember, Paul talked about not eating meat sacrificed to idols. Remember? Chapter 8. It's a great study in this chapter, chapter 8. He said we shouldn't eat meat that's offered to idols. He says, but the truth is, I have a right to do it. I have the liberty to eat the meat. But love is greater than liberty. Because I love you, I won't even do it. You know what that tells me? Sometimes it's right to put your rights aside for a greater cause.
That's good. Yep. Amen.
Well, I have the right, Paul said, to do it, but I'm not going to do it because I love you, and my love for you is bigger than my love for my rights, so I'm going to put it aside. Why don't we do that? You know why? Because we don't like to do that.
Right.
I have rights, I have this liberty, and I don't want people telling me I can't have my rights and my liberty. And I could put them aside, but I'd rather not put them aside because it's my right to not put it aside. And I have the liberty to do it, and so I have the right to do it, so be quiet about it. That's kind of how we look at things sometimes. So you read this passage, 9, 1 through 18, it does two things for us. First, it gives us some insight. As you started reading, you got the idea. It gives some insight to us as members of a local church, how we are to take care of our spiritual leaders. I mean, it's very practical. He's just talking about very practical things, how a church should take care of its spiritual leaders, those who work for their spiritual benefit. And you say, I don't understand. It means this, how you're supposed to pay the preacher. That's basically what he's writing about. Should you, how should you financially take care of God's man? I mean, he spells that out. Secondly, it tells us this. It takes us back to chapter 8 concerning liberty and how love limits liberty. And so you look at chapter 8, you look at chapter 9, and they seem very different on the surface. You got meat offered to idols in chapter 8. You got paying the preacher in chapter number 9. It looks like they have nothing to do with each other, but there's a similar theme, and he even revisits it again in chapter number 10, and the theme is this. You have liberty to do some things, but you shouldn't do some things because you love. Love limits liberty. And Paul talked about that in chapter number 8. He said, I have the right, the liberty to eat meat, but I'm willingly putting that right aside, that liberty aside for your good, for the good of the gospel. And now he's about to say, I have a right to take money from you. I have a right to live off the gospel, but I'm about to tell you why I'm not going to. That's basically what we see in chapter number 9. So as we go through here, some of this you'll think, well, this has nothing to do with me because, well, I'm not living off the gospel, I'm not paid to be a pastor, and I don't really understand what this has to do with me. But really, it has to do with all of us. If you're a member, it has something to do with you. And if you're in full-time ministry, it has something to do with you. And if you're a believer, it has something to do with you because you've got some liberty and some rights. And you may have to, before we get done, think about whether you should put some of them aside.
That's good.
Point number 1. First 6 verses, Paul talks about his rights as an apostle. Evidently, he's defending himself against someone who even questioned his apostleship. As you notice in the first verse, he opens up by saying, am I not an apostle? And he begins saying, hey, I'm an apostle. He says, am I not an apostle? The answer is yes. Am I not free? Yes, I'm not bound. Have I not seen Christ? All the apostles had to see Christ physically. Was he not in that category? Oh yeah, on the road to Damascus. He saw Christ. I am an apostle. And then he says, even if I'm not an apostle unto others, in verse number 2, for you I am an apostle because you're my work. You're my proof of apostleship. You, in the Lord, I have worked and you got saved, and I have worked and you're growing in Christ. And so the proof of my apostleship is, if anything else, it's you.
Yeah. Good.
Listen to what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. Truly, the signs of an apostle will run among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. He says, I am an apostle. I've seen Jesus. You're converted because of me. And not only that, in 2 Corinthians it says, you've even seen great miracles at my hands. Of course I'm an apostle. He doesn't spend a lot of time defending himself, his apostleship, but he's definitely an apostle. And I just put in my notes this one question. If someone demanded proof of your genuineness, could you prove it? He says, yeah, you think I'm not an apostle? Here you go. Boom, 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 boom. Did you see these things? Oh, yeah, well, I guess you are. If someone demanded proof of your genuineness as just a believer, would you have a hard time proving it? Could you stand on the witness stand, or would you be convicted or not convicted?
Yeah, that's good.
Paul just spelled it out. And I'm just wondering, I'm just sitting here thinking, boy, if I had to prove I'm a believer, I'm hoping it wouldn't be much of a stretch. I'm hoping it wouldn't be just, well, I go to church every Sunday. Yeah, a lot of people do. That doesn't mean doodly for most. That was greedy. But he leaves no questions. Hey, I am an apostle, and since I'm an apostle, I have all the rights of apostleship. There's certain things that come with being an apostle, and since I am one, I have those things. Look what he says in verse number 3. Hey, my answer to those who are going to examine me and wonder about this thing is this. Do I have the power to eat and drink? In other words, do I not have liberty to ask from you basic necessities? Well, yes, you're an apostle. You certainly do. Do I like how he says in verse number 5, do I not have the power or the liberty to lead about a wife? Evidently, what he's saying is, hey, the other apostles lead about their wives. Look what he says. He even says, Cephas does. The other apostles and Jesus' brothers, they lead their wives about. Do I lead my wife about? No, I don't even have a wife. Now, I have the liberty to do it. I have the power to do it. It should be okay if I do it, but I don't do it. I don't lead about a wife. I can picture Peter. All right, come on. Lead about my wife. I think lead about just means drags her around with him. Goes from place to place, takes his family. Now, you know about Paul, on a side here. He chose not to have a wife for the sake of the ministry. He wrote himself, he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, that he may please his wife. There's nothing wrong with that. If you're married, you're going to care about pleasing your wife. But he made a choice not to, for the sake of ministry. Again, it's like everything he did was for the sake of the gospel, was it not? Others led about a wife. Others had families. But he said, I'm for the sake of the ministry not going to have a wife. Never did he imply that you shouldn't have a wife. Men, praise the Lord. Never did he imply that you shouldn't. In fact, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if they cannot contain, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to burn. I used to read that as a kid. I don't understand what that means. You're like, I don't, because I remember not wanting to get married. You remember those days? You're like 10 years old. I don't want to get married. And then Paul said, well, you got to get married or burn. Take your pick. Okay. No wonder all these guys are getting married. Burn at the stake or get married. Take your pick. You know what he's saying. I'm getting into it. I will tell you this, man, you get a good wife. If you're going to go into ministry, you get a good wife, it's going to be a huge asset to your ministry. And Paul never one time hinted that having a wife is not going to be an asset to your ministry. In fact, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. You just find the right mate. It's going to be of utmost importance that you find the right mate. And then he says, do I have, listen what he says in verse number 6. Look how he words it. Evidently Barnabas and he are evidently on kind of the being thought of the same. Or is it only Barnabas and I? Is it only the two of us that have not the power to forbear working? In other words, is it only Barnabas and I that should not make a living off of the gospel and off of ministry? Forbear working or having outside employment. Is it only us two that are being singled out here? And so he's setting up his case to explain, hey, I have a right and a liberty to be paid physical stuff from you. In fact, that's my second point. Paul has a right to be paid, and he's going to spell it out. And look at the illustrations he gives, starting in verse number 7. He gives us some simple examples. In verse number 7, he says this, who goeth to warfare at any time with his own charges? He says, does a soldier buy his own uniform? Does a soldier go to the store and buy his own sword and his own shield and his spear and whatever else he needs to fight? Does he join the army, or is he drafted into the army and then they send him to the store to buy his own stuff? No, of course not. That's a simple example. And then he says in verse number 7, and who planteth a vineyard and eateth not the fruit thereof? So in other words, he says, shouldn't a farmer, doesn't it make sense if you're a farmer, whether it be some crop or grapes, doesn't it make sense that if you raise that crop and you spend all the time and the effort to make it grow, doesn't it make sense that you get to eat some of it? First in line? Of course it makes sense. Also in verse number 7, he says this, and what shepherd? If you're a shepherd and you've got goats and they drink goat's milk, and if you're a shepherd and you have these goats, and shouldn't you be the first one in line to drink some milk of the flock? Doesn't it make sense that because you spend all the time and the effort to raise these animals that you would get to enjoy the milk from that flock? Well, of course, that only makes sense. He's just talking about things that make sense, simple examples. In other words, those occupations have perks. And the perks are, hey, if you're a soldier, free swords. If you're a farmer, free food. If you raise goats, free milk. Those things come with that. Anything else would be absurd. Common sense would say, hey, those things are going to be, just because you are in those fields, those things come to you. Now, I don't know if Paul really meant to use those on purpose for this reason, but it almost makes sense that as he used those three examples, he's also using those examples to intend, or at least imply, three functions of a good minister, of a good pastor, of a good preacher. Think about it. He's saying a soldier, isn't a pastor like a soldier ready to take on enemies of the church and of individual believers? And that must mean our pastor, he always has to be battle ready.
That's good.
Think about that, man, when you go into ministry. Some of you Heartland students someday, if you go into ministry, you're going to have to be a soldier, and that means any moment, battle ready. Right. Battle ready. So he used that one. That makes sense. What about a farmer? A farmer plants and cares for a growing crop. And when you think about that in relation to the ministry, you can picture the pastor as he plants seed and he watches tender plants begin to grow, and he waters them and he cares for them through the ministry of the word and through the ministry of preaching and counseling. And he's watching it grow in people's lives through patience and helping people grow, and seeing the work of every pastor in a farmer. And even a shepherd is not all in other places. The under shepherd, even that term used as a term for a pastor who watches over his flock, and he's vigilant, and he's on guard, and he's loving, and he's caring over his flock. And whether or not Paul used those three illustrations just off the top of his head, or whether he meant to point those at the duties of a pastor, it sure makes sense. When I think of our pastor, Brother Gaddis, I can think of all three of those things at once. I'm so glad he's a soldier and he's battle ready any minute. And he's like a tender shepherd watching over us. And he's like a farmer and he's watching that crop and he's watering and he's caring and he's watching us grow. I think of that in relationship to him easily. And then in verse number 8 he says, now look, the law says the same thing. The law also says the same thing. Well, what does the law say? Here it is, verse 9. Moses said this in his law, don't muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. What in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, it's simple. If you got an ox and he's treading corn, that means he walks in a circle tied to this big wheel, and the big wheel has big stones, and as it turns, the corn is put there, and it's ground to a powder, and they use that to make their bread, and that ox just walks around and round and round and round. He gets no money. He's doing it for free. But one thing, anything falls on the ground, he gets to eat. Yeah. That's his pay. So he's walking and eating. He's hoping more corn falls out so he can eat it up. You don't put a muzzle on him. You don't muzzle him so he can't eat. In fact, the law, Moses put that in the law. Right. Don't you dare muzzle your ox. I bet people when they first read that, when Moses said that, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Okay, we won't. But if you read this, yeah. Evidently, God had more in mind. Yeah. Yeah. They didn't know that then. Right. Paul is enlightening us. He had more in mind than just ox. Because notice how he says it in verse number 9. Doth God take care for oxen? Okay, yeah, God loves them oxen. But verse 10, he kind of lets us in. For he saith it altogether, or he saith it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes. No doubt. Oh, he wrote that way back in the law so that later ministers of the gospel wouldn't get muzzled as they tread corn. So that later his servants, as they worked, would be allowed, would have the right, would have the liberty to be paid. Now, can I tell you here that there's an inference? Without him coming right out and saying it, here's what he's saying. Ministry is work. He didn't even have to say that, but he said it. Ministry is work. In fact, he used 3 words here in verse number 10, in verse number 9 and 10. I want you to look at. He used 3 words: treadeth. He used the word in verse number 10, ploweth, and the word thresheth. Tread, plow, and thresh. Those 3 words in those 2 verses. And I'm just here to tell you, I've never been raised on a farm, and I haven't worked on a whole lot of farms. I've driven past a lot of farms. I've seen animals. How many, when you drive by cows, go, moo? That's me. That's all I know about that. That's about the size of it. I had friends in Missouri who had a dairy farm, and every now and then I'd spend the night and help them. I don't want to do that with my life. I'm here to tell you right now. Have you ever been around a dairy farm? Cows want to be milked twice a day, and they don't even care what day it is. It's Christmas, no milking today. Oh, you think so? And they will drive you crazy. We're milked. We're getting milked. That's all I know about farms. But those 3 words say something, don't they? They say work, tread, plow, thresh. Treading, you can picture that ox walking in a circle. That's not real glamorous, is it? What are you doing over there, ox? Treading. Oh, that's beautiful. Nobody films that. Puts it on the screen. Look at him walk. Isn't he amazing? He's just walking in that circle. And it just gives you the idea of it's work, and it's slow, it's tedious, it's the groundwork, it's the pioneer work, it's the unseen work. That's treading. Nobody gets a big award for it. Nobody notices it. It's just hard work. If some pastor gets up in this pulpit at chapel, or you go to church, and somebody gets up and they with purpose, and they have studied and worked, there was some treading that went into that that you hadn't seen. Maybe a lot of it. And they went on to their office, and they worked, and they studied, and they read, and they prayed, and they came and delivered a message. And if you don't know this yet, now I'll tell you, that was some work put into that. It was treading, wasn't glamorous. Nobody came in and applauded, but it was work. Then there's plowing. What is plowing? Well, that's when you get the ground ready to plant seed. And even Jesus talked about that. He said, put your hand to the plow and don't look back. That's also hard work, plowing, isn't it? But then there's threshing. Treading, that's hard. Plowing, that's hard. Threshing is hard, but threshing, that lets us know that there's been a harvest. Because threshing means the harvest has come in, it's arrived, and now the grain can be used, and now we can celebrate because the threshing has come and the harvest has come. But there's no threshing without plowing. You can't have harvest until you planted and worked. You say, oh, Brother Gaddis, he's over there pastoring that big church. How glamorous is that? People have him come to preach. Man, it's so glamorous. One of these days, I hope I have, I'm just telling you, that doesn't happen without some plowing first. Amen. Some treading around in circles. And some things that aren't so glamorous and nobody knows about. All that goes in. Those three words lets us know it is work. It's work. Paul said, I've been working. I've been treading. Been plowing. I've been threshing. And so he says it this way, in verse number 11. We've sown unto you spiritual things. Is it a great thing if we should reap your carnal thing? It's like he's saying, is it so much to ask? That because of the spiritual work we've invested in your lives, that the carnal stuff that you have, carnal not being a bad word, just being material stuff, that we would share that you would give that? Is that too much to ask? Or, as he says in verse number 12, if others have been partakers of this power over you, are not rather we? In other words, some others have. Evidently, you've given to others, but not to us. Why is that? But he says in verse number 12, which really is the key, we'll come back to this, we suffer all things lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. We're about to see the key is why he's refused. He even takes them to in verse number 13 to some Old Testament example. Know ye not that those which minister about the holy things of the things of the temple and those which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? He takes them all the way back to the Old Testament priests. And he said, hey, didn't in the Old Testament times, weren't the priests able to eat the showbread? Didn't the priests get to partake of some of that meat that was given to sacrifice? Wasn't that their pay? Wasn't that their food? Isn't that how they lived? They lived off those things that were considered holy, those things of the temple. Isn't that how the priests were fed and how they lived? And the answer is yes. So we have an Old Testament example. And then he says, and look what he says in verse 14, even the Lord, Jesus Christ himself, ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Luke chapter 10 says this, and in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give. These are Jesus' words. For the laborer is worthy of his hire. So even Jesus, the Old Testament has a great example. Jesus himself said the laborer is worthy of his hire. The law says don't muzzle the ox. We've got this work that's involved. A soldier doesn't buy his own weapons, and a farmer gets to eat out of his crops, and a shepherd gets to take part of his flock. It just makes sense. That's why he says in verse number 11, I've worked all that in a spiritual sense. But since it's a spiritual work, I'm not raising crops. Since it's a spiritual work, I have no flocks. Since it's a spiritual work, I can't eat spiritual stuff. So now, I have the right, I have the liberty, and you should be generous with your carnal, your material things, and share that with those who have benefited you spiritually.
Amen.
He says. Listen to the words of Stott. If we have been on the receiving end of spiritual blessings, We want to demonstrate our thankfulness to God in tangible ways. So let's say you go tonight to McDonald's. Great place. Best French fries. I don't care where you go. You can't beat McDonald's French fries. I don't know if they're potatoes, but they're good. So you go to McDonald's, you eat, and I want a double quarter pounder with cheese and a Diet Coke. I'm watching my weight. And she says, "You want a biggie size that?" "Oh yeah, biggie size that. Biggie size French fries." So you eat that up, and then you walk immediately next door to Burger King and pay them $10. I said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I just ate at McDonald's, so here's your money." That don't make sense. You pay wherever you got food. You don't pay Burger King. Nobody wants to go there anyway. You don't pay Burger King for a meal you ate at McDonald's because you owe McDonald's for that benefit of food. Paul's saying, look, I benefited you spiritually. Now where are you going to invest your money? Who is it that you owe? Where should your carnal things be going now that you have received spiritual benefit? Should they not be coming to us? Should they not be going to those who are giving you that spiritual benefit? Maybe I should add this. If the ministry is really work, if you're doing what you should as a servant of God, you'll earn that pay. Now, some of you are going to someday go from here and be involved in full-time ministry, and they're going to pay you some money or part-time, whatever. Don't be lazy with that money. With God's people's money. You have every right and you have the liberty to be a full-time worker, and the spiritual benefit that you are giving people, they should in return give you of their carnal things. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can, if you're not careful, take advantage of people by being just a little on the lazy side and not really investing like you should in a spiritual way. Don't take advantage of spiritual work done on my behalf also by not giving of carnal things. What do you mean? I mean, when the offering plate comes by and it passes you by and you put nothing in week after week after week, what you're saying is, feed me, feed me, feed me, feed me. I don't want to pay for it, but feed me. Well, you try that at the restaurant and see how fast the police come get you. But we come to church and we want somebody to invest in the Word. Come on, and work and tread and plow and work and tread and plow and deliver the goods week after week to us, and we enjoy the spiritual benefit and the spiritual food. We just don't want to pay for it. Something wrong somewhere. Yes, sir. I'm just saying, but what does that mean? It means the tithe offering envelopes he talked about, you should take advantage of those. Even as a student. Well, Brother Ted, I make $10 a week. Well, then you owe at least $1. Right. You owe $1. Anything over that, you can give as an offering. But you owe at least $1. Start now, and then when you're making $1 million a week, it won't be so hard. $1 million a week. No, you're going in ministry, never mind. So verse number 12, now Paul's going to say, look, he's going to give his reasons why he's giving up his rights, starting in verse number 12. Evidently, others have taken money from them, as he words it in verse 12. Nevertheless, he says, we haven't used this power. We haven't done that. We haven't used this right, this privilege that we've had. Evidently, we've decided not to. We don't take money from you, but we suffer all things, so we won't hinder the gospel of Christ. We don't want to be a hindrance to the gospel. And look, he says in verse 15, I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be done so unto me. In other words, he's saying, and I'm not even writing this, so you'll feel bad and now start giving me some money.
That's not what I've got in mind here. I'm not writing this to put you on a guilt trip so you'll show up tomorrow and say, sorry, Paul, we owe you this, and give me some money. He said, I'm not even getting at that. That's not what I'm trying to do. That's not what I'm getting at. He's saying this, listen, you may have accused me, and some may have accused me of being a mercenary. Some may have accused me of only doing this for money, and that may be floating around out there that we're just running around the country and trying to do this for money. But I'm telling you, that's not the truth. And I'm telling you so much so that I'm not even going to take one dime from you. I want to prove to you that my rights, my love for you, and the gospel is greater than my rights and my liberty as an apostle. I don't want the gospel to be hindered, verse number 12, I don't want the gospel to be hindered in any way. Verse number 16, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of, for necessities laid upon me. Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. He said, truth is, I can't help but preach the gospel. Pay me or don't pay me, I'm going to be preaching the gospel. I use these three words. He's compelled, he's called, and he's commanded to preach. I've been compelled, called, and commanded to preach. If you're a young man here, you think you've been called to preach? You have been compelled, called, commanded. Well, Brother Ted, that's not me. I'm either, I've not been commanded, I've not been called to preach, I don't think I'm going to go into full-time ministry, or it's not what I'm planning to do with my life. God's not called me to do that. That may be fine, but can I tell you this also? All believers are called, compelled, and commanded to do all kinds of things that believers are supposed to do, including give, including witness, including be the kind of believer they're supposed to be. All of us are called. All of us are compelled. All of us are commanded. And maybe not the way Apostle Paul was, and maybe not the way Brother Gaddis was, and maybe not the way Brother Landy was, and maybe not the way I was, but if you're a believer in this room, you've been called to do something for him, and you've been compelled and commanded, and whether you get paid for it or not, better do it. You better do it. And I wrote this sentence down, and I believe it. Your life can preach more sermons than most preachers ever get to voice. Think of that. Your life can preach more sermons than any preacher ever gets to voice. Just with your life. Paul's reward, basically, is saying is it's going far beyond financial. My reward is way past having some finances. And I can preach the gospel, according to verse number 18, free. No charge. Let me bring this down to where you and I are right now. How important are your rights? Paul had the right to eat meat, chapter number 8. And for him to say this is what he said, listen, wherefore if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth. Did you say that? I can't even say that about meat. If someone come up to me right now and said, now if you eat another steak, you're going to offend me, I'm going to say, sorry. You shall be offended. This very night. Because I want some meat. The apostle looked, he put it in writing. And said, I would never touch another steak if it offends my brother as the world standeth. How important are your rights? Listen to him. I have the right to eat meat. Does it offend you? I'll never eat it again. Wow. Did you say that? Paul had the right to be paid. That's what chapter 9 has told us so far. He's got a right to be paid for his spiritual work. It makes sense. The Bible, the law commands, Jesus' own words confirmed. He had this liberty, he had this right, yet he put that liberty and that right aside because he said, I don't want the gospel to be hindered in any way. And so I'm going to put that right aside. It's like every time you read Paul, didn't he always have in mind others? Whether they were young believers, chapter 8. Young believers who may be offended because they see a more mature believer eating that meat that may have been sacrificed to idols. Or maybe those who aren't believers at all, they've never heard the gospel. And he doesn't want to offend them. He doesn't want it to be hindered anyway. So whatever it is, he was willing to put his rights aside for the sake of others. Now in a world that you live in, that I live in, where rights are so important, and we're always talking about what our rights are and what our rights are. And I have the right, and we have the right, and I got the right to bear arms, and I got the right to do this, and I got the right to do that. Paul is demonstrating for us believers, hey, there are times when you should be willing to put whatever rights you may have aside for the sake of other people.
Yeah.
Paul said, I love you enough that I would never eat another scrap of meat if it would offend you. I love you enough that I would take no pay from now on if it would hinder the gospel of going out or hinder your life in any way. And I have to ask you, and I have to ask myself, am I willing to do that? Now the point is not this. The point is not that we should reject income for the work of the ministry. I don't think that's even his point. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, now this is what no minister should ever be paid. He doesn't even hint that. He just says this, the point is this. I should be willing to forgo whatever liberty that I may have for the sake of others. Whatever it is, I should be willing to forgo it. Definitely, finances are in here. Because he makes a pretty good case for whatever decisions that you're going to make, they should not be based on finances. Whatever decisions you're going to make in your life, don't base them on finances. I'm just telling you, you want to get in trouble, and anybody who's been in the ministry for a while has had more than one person come up to them and say, hey, Brother Ted, we're moving. Really, where are you moving? Well, we're going to another town, and it's such and such place, another state. Oh, man, I hate to lose you, and I hate to see you go. So what are you going over there for? Well, I got a job, and this job pays a whole bunch more. Man, it pays good. So we're going to move over there. Oh, man, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there a good church there? I never thought about it. Good church. Well, I'm sure there'll be one. God, I'm sure, I got peace about this. If I had a dime for every time somebody said they had peace about something dumb, I'd be rich. Well, we're going over, and I'm just telling you, whether ministry or not, I think Paul's given us a little idea here about finances should not be our philosophy as believers, the follow the money philosophy. It has nowhere to go with us, because if you're a servant, when you're truly a servant, you do what you're supposed to do regardless of the money. But in regards to your liberty, just put yourself in this place. You can fill in the blank. I have the liberty to, now put whatever you want in that blank. Brother Ted, I have the liberty to, now for you, put whatever you want. It could be something gray. You know what I mean by gray areas? Some people just want to live in the gray area. Now there's gray areas, I understand that, but you don't have to live in them all the time. Well, I have the liberty to this. Because the Bible's not clear, or it doesn't say anything, and I don't really see a principle, so I have the liberty to. Okay, you have the liberty to. Fine, great. You're not spiritually hindered. Your conscience is clear. The Bible doesn't really give restriction. But there's others who may genuinely be offended. And I'm not talking about people who run around looking to be offended. There are those. There might be one in your dorm. You're just waiting to be offended. I just hope I can be offended so I can tell you how you've offended. Those kind of people, they need to stop being offended. Okay? I'm not talking about professional weaker brothers. I'm not talking about those. But there are genuine weaker brothers. There are people you could offend with that, whatever it is. If they see you do that, if they see you go there, if they see you act like that, if they see you watch that, if they see you listen to that, whatever it is, there are people who could be genuinely offended. So, you have the liberty, but since you could offend that person, if you do it in front of them, what are you going to do? I have the liberty. My rights. I'm an American. Sometimes our American rights get blurred with what it means to be a believer. I'm an American, I have the right to do this, and if it offends them, they need to get over it. Well, I don't know if Paul would have had that mindset.
You're right.
They can like it or lump it. They can deal with it because this is my right. And so we've taken that right, we've taken that liberty, and we've made it now into a stumbling block for some weaker brother, for some person who genuinely could be offended. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak, Paul said. Here's another question we have to ask ourselves. Who do you love enough to willingly put your liberty aside? Who do you love enough? Do you love lost people enough to put your liberty aside? Do you love those who aren't as spiritually mature as you may be to put your liberty aside for their benefit? Evidently, Paul did. And those people in 1 Corinthians weren't real lovely, but he loved them enough to put his liberty aside. How about this? I have to ask us this question. What cause is important enough that you would lay down your rights? Not just who do I love enough, but is there a cause that's so important that I put my rights aside to see that cause? I have a right to sleep in on Saturday mornings. It's my right. I've earned it. I worked hard all week, and this is my liberty and my right, and I'm going to do it. Okay. Is there a cause that's greater? That may make you get up early? It may make you do something you don't want to do? I have the right to enjoy, Brother Ted, my free time. I have a right. It's my liberty, I've earned it, and this is my right, and I can do what I want with this time, and I can do what I want with this money, and I can do what I want with my own comfort, and I can do what I want with myself. And just ask yourself a simple question when those things happen, those questions arise. Is there a cause that's greater than that right, than that liberty? Is there someone I love more than that right, than that liberty? Do I love the gospel more? Do I love church more? Do I love Jesus more? Do I want to serve more? And here we are sometimes so focused on liberty, my rights as a mature believer. And I forget sometimes there's a greater principle. We're arguing all the time about the gray areas, and I understand that, and there's room to talk about it, argue about it, what's gray, what's the Bible, I understand all that. But Paul, he talked about those gray areas, and he tried to help us with them, and then after he's done helping us, he just hit us right in the face. He said, yeah, but I'm not going to do it. Now, it's great. Here's Paul. Yeah, it's a gray area, and you can eat the meat. It's okay. And yeah, it's good. It's all right. It's gray, but it's okay. Oh, wow. Good. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to eat it. And then he hits us and says, but I'm not going to eat it.
Yeah.
Because I love him so much that I'm putting that liberty aside. I'm putting that right down. You want to serve God? Is your service a cause big enough? Do you love people? Do you love the gospel? If we could sum up Paul's words, sum up these verses in this sentence, Paul would have said this: I have no rights. I'm a servant, and I'll do what it takes to see the gospel proclaimed. That's Paul. When you think about it, that's his life. I have no rights. I'm a servant, and I'll do whatever it takes to see the gospel proclaimed. Let's bow our heads, close our eyes.